Thank you. Love the tone. I still have one person yet to take the exam, so hopefully she'll get it today or Thursday latest. But in lab on Thursday, I'll have the exams for you I'll turn them in so you can take a look at them, make notes, and just give them back to me. Maybe I made some mistakes. It's easy, and we'll go from there. So everything will be there. And I did finally remember to get them, bring them home and post them. It's just me. Sorry, and I actually have finally sequestered the lab quizzes, so I should get those done at some juncture today. But I suspect that they're going to all be very good. That's just a guess. So without further ado, that's what we got going on. So a check with Mrs. Maurer, who is in charge of all our labs, all the science labs, and we should have the hearts available to dissect on Thursday. That'll be the major activity on Thursday. There's a very useful video that I play, a YouTube video from years ago that I've been using for the last 15 years. Nothing I did, but out of some community college in South Dakota. It's really good. And so I will be utilizing that. And typically I play If I Only Had a Heart from Wizard of Oz. Yeah, any Wizard of Oz questions? I'm a Wizard of Oz devotee. Go ahead.
Where's the lab quiz going to go? Because there's no lab section in Blackboard.
Oh, the lab. I'll put all the grades in the lecture, but it'll say lab quiz, okay. And everything will be counted separately. So lab quiz will say points. I mean, it's possible I might open up let me take a look and see what vehicle I have. Whether or not I just put in the lab for grades and just open that, because I typically don't utilize that. Sometimes I utilize it for exams, if we do online or Blackboard exams, which is certainly a possibility. Okay. So that's the so far about that. We'll get to it. All right. Let me see, anything else? No Wizard of Oz questions? You know why it's called Oz? See? You should have, when Frank L. Baum, who wrote that around the turn of the last century, around 19, it was a very popular children's book, as you might know, there's like 5 of them. His filing cabinets went A through N and O through Z. So, or A through, yeah, like that. And so he sort of O through Z, and it went, I'll call it Oz. See? Learn something new every day. Oh, God, you're just not fun. There's a lot of very good trivia from that. The lady who played Margaret Hamilton, who's wonderful, and died, I think, in the 1990s. She was on Mr. Rogers to basically years ago to tell everybody that there are no such thing as witches. Which I'm a little, given we're coming to Halloween, okay. But she made an appearance there, and if you didn't know it, she was a kindergarten teacher back in like in the 30s. So because most of the Hollywood actors and actresses had, they didn't make a lot of money unless they were stars. So she was a character actress, and she got a call from, she was teaching kindergarten. They got a call from her agent saying, Maggie, that's what name she went by, they want you to be a Wizard of Oz. She goes, oh, what part do they want me to have? She goes, the witch. Thanks. Immortal. Just saying. See, little trivia like that is such fun. You watched it when you were little. Admit it. See, thank you. That was one of those movies they showed like once a year. Before the age of streaming, things like Sound of Music and 10 Commandments, those were once a year things. 10 Commandments would be at Easter, and Ben-Hur would be at Easter, and Christmas Day, and they still do it now. It's a Wonderful Life, or the Jewish version, It's a Life. You have to be familiar with that art, with Borscht Belt humor. No? You're not. See, Jewish, how are things? All right. How's business? We're doing okay. So it's wonderful. It's a life. That's how it works in my day and age. That's how we do all those things. It's like Jewish Christmas carols. We have them for Hanukkah. Rudolph the Reform Rabbi had a kid in dental school. You never heard that one? So much for that. My feeble attempts at humor have failed. On to the blood, which there's been a bloodletting already here. So what we're going to work on today, we'll finish the hemostasis clotting unit and talk a little bit about transfusions, which are important. And then we're going to start something that's more difficult, which is the physiology of the heart. So, and if you probably have done the blood types and the blood groups, but I'll give you the lowdown on that. It's very interesting, very relevant. So all of those things are important. Okay, so we start with this. When they call them thromboembolic disorder, a thrombus is a blood clot. If that clot or part of it breaks off from a blood vessel and moves someplace and lodges, it's called an embolus. That's the distinction between a thrombus and an embolus. So a lot of them start as thrombi, which is the plural, and embolize, and they travel to other places. There's a variety of reasons. Okay, so you have either clotting disorders or prevention of clotting. And this is interesting. You don't see it a lot. It's called DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation. One of the times that you can see it is in a lot of times certain pregnancies where there has been a rupture prematurely in amniotic fluid surrounding the baby gets into the bloodstream. It can generate that. But it's more often from something called gram-negative sepsis. Think of rupturing an appendix. You rupture an appendix, all this bacteria, most of which goes under the heading of gram-negative. Okay. And my dog threw up. My stepson's there. Okay. And goes under the heading of gram-negative. And those gram-negatives produce a rather vigorous reaction that's different than, say, like you're getting a strep throat. Okay, it's a more generalized reaction. If that gets into the bloodstream, what it does is it gobble up all the clotting factors. And so you either have clotting that occurs or you have the absence of clotting. And I've seen it. It's very scary. That's there. So here's the definition. Thrombus, a clot that develops in a blood vessel. And all of those things, it can certainly, not just tissue death, it can lead to death. So if you get one going in your brain, that could lead to brain death, which is death. Or one in the heart will be a heart attack. And so all of that's part of an embolus, where the thrombus is not so much floating, but it breaks off is a better way to describe it. Okay, and perhaps the most common ones come from your legs. In people who have been in bed for a long time, it's called a pulmonary embolus because it starts in the veins deep in your calf. And we'll look at those a little bit when we do the blood vessels, which we'll be doing in lab, not Thursday, but a week from Thursday. And what they begin to do is to break, they kind of get free. And as they get into the veins, as they're going back to the heart, get larger and larger. Even in the heart, comparatively, the openings are large. So where do they start to get small again when they could get trapped? When they get to the lung. And it's called a pulmonary embolism, which you really have to be on the lookout for. And there's all sorts of things. Blood stasis or immobility is a big problem. So in the hospital, what we do when somebody, nowadays they get people home pretty quickly. But in the old days, people would be in the hospital for, long periods of time, week, 10 days, even longer. It's very much different now with the way insurance is governed and the available we have for home care. And what they would do is they get people up we'd have people up after hip surgery. The next day, be in a chair that day and down in physical therapy, learning how to walk the next day. If they had major abdominal surgery, which I did on 2 occasions, you were up walking around the next day because it's the best way to kind of get everything starting to get going again. That was inside. So there's a lot of information about that. So these are agents or drugs that can prevent undesirable clotting. And what I said, aspirin is the most common, it's the easiest to obtain. A lot of times as a very general anticoagulant, we'll tell people to take basically a quarter of a regular aspirin. That's like a baby aspirin a day. And you can see how it lowers the heart attack incidence. Where if we look at heparin, that's used intravenously. And that's something you use in the hospital. And again, that's something if you have a line in that sometimes little clots develop, you clear it out. It's called a heparin lock. And then for years, we used warfarin compounds. And warfarin compounds were oral anticoagulants. And there are certain things that you still have to use it. Like atrial fibrillation is probably the most common diagnosis, but it's very difficult to control. So you're trying to, you're about every other day you would have to check the levels of how rapidly the blood clot. There's a fancy blood test called prothrombin time that you'd measure. And you're looking, and there's like, it's sort of like if you do a COVID test, they have the line for the control and the line for the test. Same deal here. You look at the control and you look at for the actual reading, and it should be 1.5 times the control to keep it in the proper level. And it interferes, as you can see, with the actions of vitamin K. And so you get a variety of disorders. So when you don't have enough platelets, we call it thrombocytopenia. So thrombocytes are another name for platelets. Penia implies not enough. Saying, okay. So what you'll see, and you'll see these sometimes, they're called petechiae. And you'll see an illustration shortly. And they're like little dots where blood has clotted and appears in the skin, almost like a speckle pattern, like a bunch of freckles where it shouldn't be. And a variety of things, as you can see, do it. Platelet counts are very low. You remember I showed you some of mine. And this is where we do platelet transfusions. A lot of people, this was something for my dad. Now, my dad didn't survive open heart surgery, unfortunately, way back when, 35 years ago. But then it was typical that you had platelet donors. Okay. People had to donate platelets because they used a lot of platelets because they were concerned about an absence of clotting for that surgery at that time. I do not think it's used quite as much as it used to be because we have better techniques for doing things called stents or angioplasties, where they feed up a catheter and they expand it and they put a stent in to maintain the opening in a blood vessel rather than do this open heart procedure. Okay. And so that's another issue. And this is what petechiae look like. And we even grade them by their size. So those petechiae are tiny little dots, like a bunch of freckles. And if you see purpura, they're big. So we even would grade them traditionally. So there's purpura, there's different terms that are associated. Sometimes they're just about allergic phenomena as well that can happen. So as we look at bleeding disorders, really the big thing is impairment of the liver, because that's where the clotting factors are made. Yes, vitamin K deficiencies, so it could be dietary or absorptive, and certainly anything that affects the liver, like hepatitis or cirrhosis. So all of those things, as you can see, liver plays a big role in all of that. So, as medical science has come forward, we pay a lot more attention to the liver these days. Okay? So, and it's even though it's still the most common sources of reason why people's liver fails is alcohol abuse by far. And that's what generates cirrhosis or alcoholic hepatitis. It's not the only reason. Obviously, we have infectious diseases. When you have micro, you'll learn, I'm sure, a bit about hepatitis B and hepatitis C, even hepatitis A, which is a little less problematic, though certainly not innocent. And those are just the common ones. There's other letters in the alphabet that work for hepatitis as well. And sometimes it just has to do with disease. Interesting anecdote. We learned a lot about livers here in Pittsburgh because this was the transplant center. A doctor from Denver named Thomas Starzl, who's now deceased, came here in the early 80s and really was the first one to successfully do multi-organ transplants, starting with liver transplants. And so they have it at the Starzl Institute. So this became modern transplant center. My dad's brother's daughter, so my first cousin, her first husband, and she'd already had she was about 28 years old. They'd already been married for like 7 years. They had 2 children and one on the way. And he had terminal liver disease. And she's calling me because, I was not living here, but I was living close enough to hear her ask me about it because he was on the transplant list. By the time they got the call that they wanted him to come to Pittsburgh to wait, he succumbed, age 28. So, I mean, it's not somebody who it wasn't a drinker or anything else. He was born with some kind of liver malfunction, is my understanding. Just so, I mean, it's not always somebody you don't paint with a broad brush and say something like that. So we have various deficiencies that are associated. Now, these are hereditary. It's kind of like we talked a little bit about those thalassemias causing anemias. But these are specifically clotting factors, and by far and away the most common is hemophilia A. I commented about that. That's the one. That's a factor VIII deficiency. It's passed on genetically. It's passed on from the mom's bloodline, so it's a sex-linked recessive. That's the one with Queen Victoria and all of her children, and the very interesting saga about the last czar in Russia and Anastasia. Always wondering if they were all assassinated in what was called the House. Little history for you. In 1917, in Katrinesburg, and it was called the House for Special Purpose. And when the communist regime with Lenin and those guys took over, they housed them and then finally assassinated the Tsar and his family. There was always a question as to whether or not one of the daughters, and this was the days, if you hear about a historical figure named Rasputin, who was like a crazy monk who had some kind of mystical power that was able to soothe the son, who was the next Tsar, because he had hemophilia, and they'd get giant bleeds, particularly into joints, and they would be screaming in pain all the time. For some reason, he could calm the child. And that's why he became sort of very, very close to the Tsar's family. It's very interesting historical stuff. Very interesting. There's been a lot written about it, a lot of movies about it, a lot of serial type series about that. Interestingly, there's something called hemophilia B and C. As you can see, these are a little less common. They're a little milder. And so now we have the genetically engineered factors. Then we did not. So all you could do was to try to do transfusions that had the factors in them. And the problem is, prior to 1987, there was a substantial risk of hepatitis or HIV. And again, I think I mentioned to you, my first wife, when she had, a surgery for what was called wedging the ovaries, she had to bleed. They had to give her a couple units of blood at Shadyside Hospital right here in town, big hospital, part of the UPMC. In 1981, she was exposed to hepatitis C. So, and there's always been a risk of that with regard to your health, because when your overall health fails, the hepatitis C can kind of make a comeback. So I had to be tested for it because it's sexually transmitted. Hers was blood and body fluids, but sexual contact can do it as well. And so I was tested for some of the medicines. I was untested negative, but it was really significant. Just to let you know, here's the DIC, clotting and bleeding simultaneously. Bleeding follows because the residual blood isn't able to clot because you gobbled up the clotting factor. So it induces clotting, gobbles up all the factors. Septicemia, that's with these gram negatives. That would be a ruptured appendix. Incompatible blood transfusion, we're going to get to that. And the leakage, as you can see, in pregnancy of the amniotic fluid. So all of those are factors where you can see. We had actually our family's first dog. My kids were little, died of but he had some kind of tumor, and it ruptured the bowel, and he succumbed to that. Comparatively young, unfortunately. Which brings us to the transfusions, and unfortunately, I'm an expert. Okay. When I had bleeding ulcers, I had probably somewhere between 50 and 75 units of other people's blood. Okay. And they must have, I must have gotten it from somebody with very witty and clever, because I became that. It's not how it works. See, most of you, if you were on your game, you'd go, you're really not that witty and clever. You can say that to me. I don't take offense at that. So we're able to, our system shuts down bleeding, increases productions of RBCs. And as you can see, what happens as it gets lower, first signs you would look someone who's pale. So if normal is 15, you get to somewhere between 10 and 12, that person looks very pale and is very weak. If you get lower than that, okay, they're really at risk of that. That's if the blood loss is rapid. I had my blood at one point when it was the most severe, prior to me being hospitalized for a substantial amount of time and eventually having surgery. They had to hospitalize me for 9 days and give me transfusions to make me healthy enough to go home for a couple of days and come back and spend 10 days in the hospital with major abdominal surgery. So I spent the better part of 2 weeks, 3 weeks in the hospital back in June of 2000. Nevertheless, my count was 5%. So chronic blood loss, I was dealing with roughly 2/3 less available blood, or less available red blood cells, to give you an idea of the severity of it. So, so unfortunately, I'm here today, so you're stuck with me. I'm happy about it. So, shock from low blood volume. I was a mess. Okay, like I said, couldn't walk up 3 steps without having to stop. Volume must be replaced immediately. So when you have acute blood loss, there's different things that you do. We said that's when, if there's a big accident, somebody's bleeding all over the place, they come to the emergency room, we use whole blood. A lot of times, what you have to do, if you use the whole blood, you also have to replace the volume. This is a famous solution called Ringer's lactate, and it's similar to the electrolytes that are there. We use media that's osmotically balanced, meaning it mimics the osmotic quality of plasma. So it has the same sort of composition, salts and sugars, and the lactate is like that. Normal saline is just water with a pinch of salt. But when you add up, when you crunch the numbers, salt ionizes into sodium and chloride. So for every little drop of salt, you get 2 particles. And you look at the things like the molecular weight, which you can figure out from that, and all the chemistry that some of you may have done. And so it's 0.9% saline. So it's just a tiny amount of salt, less than a gram of saline for 100 milliliters of water, for roughly 3+ ounces of water. For sugar, we use 5 grams of sugar. Okay, because sugar just ionizes into 1 sugar particle. So even though it's heavier, and so that's called D5W, which is dextrose 5% in water. That's not used quite as much as normal saline is. I don't know why anymore, why it fell out of favor. That's not an awfully high sugar concentration. Dextrose, glucose is really, and a lot of chemicals are like that. They are really 2 sugars at once. Okay. And they have mirror image particles. You don't have to know this. These are called, they have right and left-handed form. So glucose is composed of something called dextrose. I was talking about, we use right-handed sugars. Like they're shaped like this, if you can imagine the way they are molecularly. And they have left-handed ones, that's called levulose, which we don't utilize for energy. And so they use levulose-type products to make artificial sweeteners. Because even though they taste sweet, we don't make them into energy. There's a lot of, so if you're on the keto diet, there's something called allulose. There's different things that you can use. A lot of these are fermentation products made by bacteria on sugars that still taste like sugars, but we don't metabolize. So they don't produce quote unquote calories, just to give you an idea. So replacement of volume restores the circulation, but does not replace the red blood cells. And that's why we spin down the blood and pack the red cells, because that's the oxygen carrier. So most transfusions are packed cells, other than those that are in an emergency basis where you're trying to deal with blood loss. That's there. And we try to use type-specific blood when we can. Sometimes that's not an option. I'm going to get to that. So blood transfusions, when blood loss is rapid and substantial, big accidents, something like that. Pack cells, plasma, and what the advantage, they didn't know about this before diseases, but white blood cells basically carried the HIV, and the plasma carried the hepatitis C, as well as the hepatitis B. So plaque cells, which were used extensively in the 70s, patients who got that statistically were not nearly as exposed to hep C and HIV when it reared its ugly head. And we've started to see a lot of that in the 70s. I'll give you a little story about that as well. And so they began to research it, and that's when the blood bank started to become more on top of its game. One of the most famous tennis players got a transfusion and died. He got it pre-87, got it right 81, named Arthur Ashe, who was a Wimbledon champion. He was an African-American man from Virginia and from the Richmond area, and won both Wimbledon and the U.S. Open, and succumbed, and they named one of the stadium after they had that. So he's very, very famous in that regard. So he was a victim of that. He became HIV positive early on, and there were a number of people that were like that. We didn't know a lot And even though I do a little bit more of this when we deal with the immune system, we didn't understand what HIV was or how it was transmitted. We didn't even have a name for it like AIDS, even though we were seeing it in the 70s. Okay. Between 1977 and 78, I saw, and including 79, I saw multiple cases of that in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia had, as well as San Francisco, where the original research was done and the original paper was written defining what AIDS was. Those two populations had the largest statistical populations of gay men, and it was being passed more often through anal intercourse than anything else, because it tended to damage the lining and then the virus could pass in. So we were seeing AIDS-like diseases that didn't have a name. And we saw that acutely in Philadelphia, and I was a student and a resident there between 73 and 79. So we saw a ton. Just saying. Okay. So we use the pack red cells. We were talking about that when I was in medical school. Okay. Blood banks separated. They keep it probably a good 35 days, a reasonable number. I'd say a month to 2 months, depending on what kind of blood it is. We'll get to that. And so human blood groups of donated blood must be determined because of transfusion reactions. And this is the blood grouping. So classically, blood group is the ABO system. Blood type includes whether it's positive or negative. They're different genetically. Blood grouping is called multiple alleles. So normally, a typical, for you and I, if we're going to be tall or short, you have a gene that really, it's basically typical Mendelian genetics. If you have two genes that make you dominant, you might be very tall. Two genes that you might be very short. If you don't have them, if you have a mixture like most of us do, statistically, you're going to be somewhere in the middle. That is not how blood types or blood groups work. There are not two markers. There's not a dominant and recessive. There, interestingly, are two dominants and one recessive. So an allele is really a gene pair. In this case, there's three rather than just two genetically. The positive and negative is a typical Mendelian genetics. And we'll get to that, and I'll probably put something on the board with it as well. So and really the key factor when you and I get into the immune system, it's all about antigens. Years ago, before we really understood it, antigen came from the word antibody generating. That's why we named them antigens. We now know that these are markers on all of our cells. We have, just like in COVID, we have protein spikes that protrude, and whether you have a spike or not determines whether your bloodstream will respond to it. When you're born, you have like a 6-month grace period where your mom's antibodies are taking care of you, keeping you disease-free. That's the same time where your immune system kind of determines what's you and what's not. We call it self versus non-self. And we'll explore this again in the immune system. All right. So because of that, we realize if for some reason you get an antigen that you're not acquainted with, your body will respond aggressively. So if you get donated blood that's not compatible with your blood, your immune system will go nuts. It'll make a slew of antibodies. They'll attack all those blood cells. They'll form clumps of them. The clumps will settle in your kidneys, block them, and you'll probably your kidneys will fail, and you may even die, and sometimes rapidly because of it. That's how significant it is. Okay, so the antigens are referred to. So the antigens, anything perceived as foreign, can generate an immune response. So we have self and non-self antigens. These are called agglutinogens because the way your body responds, it's called agglutination. Basically, it forms clumps of these red blood cells. That's what agglutination is. So the floating antibodies will latch onto multiple red cells and form a big clump. That's why you can see that. If you did, maybe in high school, you tested your blood to see if you were A, B, or O. Do some of you do that? Finger sticks, just ringing a bell. You'll see you'll see these little, they'll start to clump up. So mismatched blood, potentially fatal. So we have at least we have three big ones. Okay, there's a lot of other significant antigens. So when they're look at me, I have a very, very common blood type called A positive, second most common. O positives first and A positive. Normally, that's not difficult to match up, but it's not just A positive. You have to match up a lot of these other antigens in order to find compatible blood. Every time you have a transfusion, you build up antibodies, and so that also has to be taken into account. And by the time I had these multiple transfusions, it didn't take like an hour to find the blood, it took 2 days to find it. And there's a network of blood banks, if you did not know. We have one in Pittsburgh. The next closest one would be, interestingly, in Buffalo. So we look for that, how we classify them. So there's lots of different antigens because they're weak, and we don't worry about them so much in transfusions. So the ABO and RH are very, very reactive, and that's why we look at them. And you're going to see how it works in a second. So basically, and you'll see the illustration is better than me drawing it. Type A has an A antigen only. It also makes antibodies to B. And you're going to see if A and B blood get mixed, big trouble. Type B has a surface antigen to B and makes antibodies to A. So if you mistakenly gave type A blood to someone with type B blood, they would be in big trouble. And you might say, well, that's not going to happen. The reality is it can happen anywhere. Here's the anecdote, and it's very famous. Nothing I made up. Take an important hospital. We're not talking about Bill's Hospital and Washing Machine Repair Shop in Podunk, Iowa. No fun for you people from Iowa. I'm just making up a name. Duke University Medical Center. On anybody's top 10 list of best medical centers in the United States. They had, and this was the day when we didn't do same person transplant. We didn't transplant livers from relatives. Somebody had to die, and we were rushed to get that liver for somebody who was recently deceased to a compatible donor. They had a man waiting for a liver. They found the liver. They were flying it in. Obviously, he's critically ill. He died. Rapidly, they looked for a replacement. There was a young woman who appeared to be a compatible liver based on the markers. So they transplanted her because she was next on the list. And the operation took about 6 hours. It was completely successful. And 2 days later, she was dead. And the reason was nobody thought a high school student would have figured it out. They didn't check the blood types. So it was one of those A to B, B to A type of things. The first thing you should check, and it's at Duke. And if you've worked in hospitals, as many of you might aspire to do, that's why we check everything. To give somebody a transfusion, one person can't do it. You have to have two. One person can do it technically. There's nothing more putting something in an IV line. Okay, you have to check the band, the label on the bag of blood, the orders in the chart, all of those identifiers, and two people have to sign off. Okay, because it's less likely that one person might make a mistake. It's much less likely that two. So AB, Happy Dance, has both antigens. It's all about the antigens. Type O doesn't have any. Okay? So when you look at it genetically, it's really hard to understand because you could have type A like I do if you had an A's dominant, if you had A, or you had A, we draw it as I, the recessive. B and I. O would have to be both recessives, and AB would have just those specific. Interestingly enough, both recessives are the most common blood type. That's sort of counterintuitive genetics, and I don't have an answer for it. The least common is AB. That is there. So you would think that A or B would be the most common. It's just not the way it works. So you have basically three choices, A, B, or the recessive, and you only have 6 combinations. So these give you A blood, these give you B blood, this gives you O, this gives you AB. This has the one marker, the A antigen. This has the B. This has neither. This has both. So for years, we always talked about AB being the universal recipient because you wouldn't get a foreign antigen. But that's not entirely true. Indeed, AB positive is a true universal recipient because it's got all three major antigens. Where O is thought to be the universal donor. Well, there's no antigens, but the reality is O positive is not, O neg is. Because it doesn't have any of the three major antigens. That's why they're always, O neg goes first. So when someone comes in to the hospital emergency room and they're bleeding all over the place and you got to start blood right away, you immediately start O neg. It always goes first because it's your best chance not to have a transfusion reaction. And then you load that in and then you order, then you start testing for type specific blood by the time they get to the operating, if they survive. So all of the negatives, as you will see, because they're missing that antigen, are a little bit harder to find. Statistically, that's basic Mendelian genetics. So you have you and I, mom and dad either have a positive, negative, positive, or both negatives. These are all positive. The distribution is such, you would think it would be 3-to-1, but in reality, most people are positive, marry other people who are positive, so it's about 80-20. Statistically, maybe up to 85-15. Just over time, that has occurred. So you'll see what's going on. Okay. So blood may contain preformed antibodies. You don't have to be exposed to something. We are pre-programmed genetically to make certain antibodies. In micro, I teach about a disease that's relatively common and has sort of become, its name is, it's called rotavirus. It's the infantile diarrhea virus. It's a virus that's everywhere in the Southwest and in Central America and Mexico. It's very common. However, for years it was very rare in the North and the Northeast. As we've seen an influx of folks of Hispanic and Latin backgrounds, Latin American backgrounds, making their way up, we're seeing more of this virus. Okay. And so it's a very, very common virus. It was so endemic, meaning so much accumulated in that area, that what happened over time was people developed antibodies and were programmed to make antibodies. Folks, we now have a vaccine that's been generated that's on the list, frequently given to infants because it's such a problem. Only people who were very stupid would take a 10-month-old child to visit friends like in San Antonio for New Year's who have never been exposed to that. And if they were unlucky like we were, our 10-month-old child wouldn't have spent 7 days in Santa Rosa Children's Medical Center in San Antonio because he got deathly ill during that. That young man now is 40 years old, is the captain of a destroyer. Who were his parents? I was one of them. There's a message here. Okay. Whenever you travel someplace and you have small children, be very careful and make sure you know what's going on. Because it was another couple, we were very, very close. We were both in the same adoption agency. We adopted before and they were unable to because of the way we were. But that's another long story I talk about in reproductive physiology. And my poor kid nearly died. He had to do a spinal tap. They thought he had meningitis, the whole 9 yards. That was a very long 10 days. But I still like San Antonio. The Riverwalk's great if you ever get a chance to go down there. Anybody been to San Antonio? Riverwalk. It's not my favorite city. My favorite city is New Orleans. So much food, so little time. Beignets. Jambalaya. Etouffee. Gumbo. So moving on. So they form at about 2 months of age, and by the time you're 8 or 10, you're good. Here's what it looks like. So AB blood, you can see the little spikes on it. Okay, they've got the antigens. B blood and has the circle antigen for B, and the way they've drawn that, you can see it's like a lock and key kind of phenomena where they come together. So you can see all of those things. You can see sort of the way it is statistically. So in folks who are, if you want to just call it white and black, whatever is politically correct, and I apologize, I don't mean to offend anybody. So we can see that type A 40%, type O 45%, or maybe a little bit less in folks of color statistically, but greater, we see a greater preponderance of O. And you can see how little AB is. And then when you factor in the likelihood of positive or negative, okay, it becomes a problem that is there. So O negative, again, because it's absent of all of those antigenic markers and the fact that the antibodies typically travel in the plasma section, it makes it very desirable to use pack cells, particularly that are O negative, if you have those available. So I didn't want to miss anything. Oops, here we are. So we have a lot of different factors. The one that we monitor is this one, so-called D antigen. 85% of us approximately are Rh positive. We, unlike antigens to A and antigens to B, most of the time when you make an antibody, it's because you've been exposed. And this is the significant feature for any women who are going to have babies who are Rh negative. If the father is also Rh negative, it's not a concern. But since 85% of the time the dad is Rh positive, it is a concern. And we're getting to this. So anti-Rh antibodies form in an Rh negative mom, for instance, who either gets Rh positive blood or if they have an Rh positive fetus. It doesn't matter when the baby is born, if the baby has, unfortunately, there's a miscarriage or if somebody chooses to terminate the pregnancy, whatever your feelings are about that, okay, what happens is now the mom has been exposed to Rh positive blood. They start to make antibodies. And it's not that pregnancy that causes the problem, it's the next one. And that second exposure can be significant problems. And all doctors are attuned to this if they are aware of this. But what it leads to is called hemolytic disease of the newborn. And the problem with that specifically is called erythroblastosis fetalis, as you can see. Rh negative mom with Rh positive fetus, second time around. Okay. The second pregnancy, antibodies cross the placental barrier and attack the baby's blood supply and can kill them. Okay. So pre-birth transfusions, what they use is something called RhoGAM, a serum containing anti-Rh can prevent that mom from being sensitized that are there. So, and again, anybody who has Rh negative, you should be made aware of that, and the physician should be made aware of it so they can deal with it appropriately. So, other transfusion reactions, anything that's mismatched, they will agglutinate, they'll release hemoglobin into the bloodstream, oxygen carrying capacity, decrease blood flow. Particularly so, we see things in the kidney tubules that are there. And so this is what when I had all these transfusions, the absolute first thing they told you was when you go home, check your temperature every hour. If you saw the temperature start, that was the first sign. I was lucky, I never had one. So again, the true universal donor, O neg, the true universal recipient, AB positive. Okay, so different kinds of transfusions. Okay, pre-donating someone's blood if you know you're going to have a hip replacement or maybe major plastic surgery is something that's done. Your blood's always safer for you, is the safest for you. Again, then it's blood bank blood, then it's what's called directed donation. And statistically, blood bank blood these days is safer. And so as you can see, donor blood is mixed with antibodies against common agglutinogens. Okay, so if that's present, clumping will occur. So they can make a determination Okay, blood is typed for A, B, O, and RH. That's the standard A positive, B negative, etc. And the whole idea is called cross matching to try to determine. That's what the blood bank does, and that's what I was talking about. So if you did this, and a lot of folks did, they did a finger stick. They got a couple little droplets of blood on a card. They mixed it with the serum, and you look for the clumping. So that's what agglutination looks like. Either it's present or absent. So A, B would have clumped to both, A to one, B to the other, O to neither. So all of those things are part of it. We can check a lot of things with blood. We can look at things microscopically, all of those types of things that are there. Okay. When we talk about the differential, I mentioned this before, that was counting the numbers of white cells that were there. There's the prothrombin time that they use for people who are on Coumadin. So all of those we see on either complete blood count or comprehensive medical panels, like typically you'll see. And that's the typical one they'll do. That's what I was showing you before on my blood. And that's everything for that. All good. Any questions? No. A little bit on the heart, and we're done. We have a certain amount of time that's left. I'm pausing for breath. All of the heart physiological stuff is in the B PowerPoint. The anatomical stuff is in the A PowerPoint, with the exception of the conducting system, which we looked at last time when we were in lab. That was all that with pacemaker potential. So a little bit, just again to review it, what is meant by having a pacemaker potential is the fact that those particular cells, even though they don't contract, they have leaky sodium gateways that allow a certain amount to come in. So again, you need to be familiar with this. We reviewed the last time, those events, the sequence that occurs with the SA node, AV bundle, right and left bundle branches, etc. So we looked at all of that type of stuff. That's there. I'm not going to go over this again and again. Again, that's an illustration you'll undoubtedly see on the practical to be able to label what those things are and then to review what the arrhythmias are. So I didn't want to go into any more of those than necessary. So again, just to reinforce the point, our heart rate is governed by an acceleratory center, which is sympathetic nerves, and an inhibitory center, which is parasympathetic nerves. They dominate. So our heart rate, which would usually be in excess of 100, the healthier you are, the better, more fit that you are, it governs your heart rate, slows it down. So resting heart rate, again, just to reinforce the point, is a very good measure of overall fitness and health. Young folks like you shouldn't have the problem unless you're really unhealthy. I was like that when I was in college and in high school. I weighed about 280. I had a love affair with food. I still do, but I controlled it a little bit. So, and they show you a little bit of those things where we have basically the distinction between the acceleratory center, which is fight or flight, and what normal governance is through the parasympathetic or vagus nerve. That's there. So there's a massive amount of contractile muscle. It's the bulk of heart muscle, which is responsible for it. And so, again, there's a whole sequence of events to at least have an idea of what goes on. When heart muscle depolarizer, when it fires, okay, what starts the process is the action potential. Again, electrical events precede mechanical events. They come before. So we open sodium channels, sodium comes in, it causes the action potential to rise very, very rapidly. At the same time, there are what are called slow calcium channels, and they prolong that plateau that you will see shortly. And again, this whole thing lasts roughly until repolarization for about about a fifth of a second, 200 milliseconds. And so that rapid efflux of potassium repolarized cells to the resting membrane potential. And then calcium itself is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, just like you probably learned about in muscle physiology, though it's a little bit different. It's there. So the difference between contractile muscle skeletal fiber in skeleton, milliseconds, in the heart, 200 milliseconds. So there's a rather, and the whole idea of that sustained contraction allows the blood to be ejected and prevents the heart from undergoing something that can occur in muscle, a true spasm. People, oh, I had a heart spasm. You can't. It's physiologically impossible. People will say that because someone has told it that, oh, that chest pain is a heart spasm. It's not. And it's kind of what it looks like. So you can see there is what we call this absolute refractory period where, so for that period of time where that muscle is firing, it can't fire a second time. It's physiologically impossible. So it's something that we will do again physiologically when we're trying to rehabilitate somebody who's had heart problems, or for someone who's trying to get into shape. We're trying, you're going, that's for treadmill activities or cross training activities, and you monitor your heart rate. And the mistake people make is when they try to go on, oh, my New Year's resolution, they're horribly out of shape. They go over to the gym, they join the gym, and they become very, very vigorous. And the trouble is you bring yourself up gradually. When you try to do something, even someone like me, certainly not in great physical condition, but if you take your time in doing it in a matter of a couple of weeks or months, you're able to sustain activity. I mean, even I can be on a treadmill and do 2 or 3 miles as long as I don't go crazy to start. And then we did the cardiogram unit. Not going to do that again. That's there, but the parts are important for you to know going forward. So all of those rhythms that you will see, that's something that's there. So now we get to really what happens on a mechanical basis. Electrical events are first, then we get mechanical events. In the world of muscle, we call those systole and diastole. And so you'll hear about what is this when you look at someone's blood pressure. Let's say it's 120/80, the sort of assumed normal, though it's not necessarily true for everybody. The systolic is the 120, the 80 is the diastolic, the resting. And so we look at that cycle of blood through in the heart during one complete heartbeat. So just like the electrical events, atrial systole and diastole are followed by ventricular systole and diastole. And so we look at this as a series of pressure and volume changes that we can kind of get an idea when they're coming based on the cardiogram, because when those spikes occur on the cardiogram, we know that mechanical events are going to follow. So what happens? In between beats, what we call mid to late diastole, 80% of the blood is passively, when you're in between beats, your ventricles are filling with blood. So about 80% flows through because the atrioventricular valves, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, are open, and the pulmonary and aortic valves are closed, those semilunar valves. At that point, once the heart starts again with the next beat, that atrial depolarization, that's what I mean by topping off the tank. And so it pushes the remaining 20% of the blood into each ventricle. And so we look closely at the volume at the end of that rest period. So again, the whole idea of the heart is efficiency. So you want it to be the volume of blood at each ventricle at the end of diastole. Depolarization, once that end diastolic volume is there and it's filled the ventricles, then when they contract, we're able to get the maximum cardiac output. The ventricles begin to erect, ventricular pressure. What it will eventually lead to is it builds up pressure within the ventricles. It will close the atrioventricular valves. Pressure will ramp up. And when that's done, it will force the semilunar valves open, and blood will either go comparatively slowly to the lungs or comparatively rapidly through the systemic circulation. And typically, the aortic pressure reaches about 120 milligrams of mercury. Then we get a period of relaxation. Okay, the ventricles, as they begin to repolarize, we start to look closely at what's called the end systolic volume, the volume of blood that's left. Your heart is as efficient as any, but it's not. Most people say, well, it probably ejects 90% of the blood. No, it ejects, the ejection fraction is about 57%. That's still very, very efficient. So even though the ventricular pressure drops again, the backflow begins to close the semilunar valves, and we're going to go over all of this, okay? And you'll be able to see it. When we look at this, and we're not going to look at this time, we'll probably look at it in lecture on Thursday and then continue on in lab, getting a better idea about this as we begin to start looking at blood vessels. You'll see something that's not part of the EKG. It's called the dicrotic notch. That's the pressure wave in the aorta. And what that does, that's the rebound that occurs in the blood vessels in the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, because they're so elastic, they're stretched, and when they rebound, they cause a secondary pressure wave that closes the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves. And if anything, what it does is it doesn't allow blood flow to be overly turbulent. Our blood flows relatively consistently without undue turbulence. That's there. So typically what happens, a normal healthy heart between 60 and 80, most of us average about 75. The actual atrial phase is about 1/10 of a second. The ventricular phase is about 3/10 of a second. And then the heart, hey, I like that. In between beats, it takes about an equal amount of time off. You want to be reborn as a heart muscle. You have to work all the time, but you get a rather substantial amount of rest. And these are the cycle that we're going to go over. I don't want to give it short shift because it's so important, but I'll jump down to the heart sounds, the very famous heart sounds, and you can hear, hey, you can certainly play a bunch of them online. The first, the loudest sound is the AV valves closing. The secondary sound is the semilunar valves closing. And people are very good, can listen to those and determine whether there's any irregularity. The name of those irregularities are called the heart murmur. Some folks are great at it. I do not have the ear for it. And so people will move, or your physician will listen to your heart or a patient's heart at those areas to listen for those sounds. Okay, and they can listen for those murmurs and determine if there's any incompetency. The sounds that are there, whether they are swishing, whether it's high pitched. Again, I'm the wrong guy to be able to explain it to you, but I'm good about cardiac output. And that's when we get into respiratory, we're going to learn that the whole idea is we want to marry the amount of oxygen that we bring in with every breath over a minute, what we call the minute volume, to this cardiac output. And cardiac output is about averaging about 75 beats per minute. And so we eject about 70 milliliters of blood to either go to the body that's been oxygenated or go to the lungs to be reoxygenated, and everything has to be equal. And that's about 5.25 liters when you do the math that are there. So we can ramp up our cardiac output from resting, even in non-athletic individuals and athletic individuals. You can really increase it maybe by a factor of 7. So that's your reserve. And that's why very, very fit individuals have a very significant cardiac reserve. Okay. So the cardiac change will input based on the two major factors that influence it: stroke volume, how much we're ejecting, and heart rate. So all of those play a particular role. So these are all factors that play a role. How efficient is venous return, how that impacts the end diastolic volume, how contractile the heart is. All of these are features that play a role. So we're going to take a look at those factors. But in the interest of time, I don't want to do them today. We've done about an hour of me blabbing. So we'll take a break and we'll come back to that in lecture next time. And again, in the lab, we're going to do heart dissection. We're going to start looking at the blood vessels before that in the laboratory. And I think that hour will be sufficient for today's lecture. So we'll conclude that now. And again, I will